Hello, and welcome to the Game Design program in the School of Media Design at Conestoga College. My name is Terry Hoganson, and I'll be your instructor for this course. I thought I would get started today with a short video, after which I'll have a question sheet for you to complete. So you can be filling that out as we go, or you can wait until afterwards to think about the contents of the video and write your responses. One of the major outcomes for this course is going to be for you to utilize the iterative game design process and identify some of the key principles of game design. Now, the iterative game design process involves proposing an idea for a game, developing a prototype of that game, playtesting it, evaluating the gameplay, what worked and what didn't, revising the design, and then repeating the entire process. Now, one of the major factors that you'd be looking for in your evaluation of your game idea also happens to be what I would consider to be one of the primary principles of game design, which is that gameplay is key. So you want players to feel engaged, you want them to be excited about playing the game and enjoy it, or have a very high fun factor with a very low anti-fun factor, which are all aspects that we will discuss in future classes. Now, in this class, we're going to focus on the development of what I would call analog games. Those would be board games, games with dice, or cards, other tabletop games, or physical games. Ultimately, we will get into the development of digital video games, but initially, so that we don't have to spend all the time learning the knowledge and skills of various software packages and involve game engines and other technical aspects, we'll be able to cover a lot more ground with analog games, where we can quickly prototype using paper, cardboard, dice, and other existing game pieces, or small game pieces that we can create quite quickly. Now, another thing that we will do later on in this class is to look at existing games. So that is even quicker, to look at an existing game that's on the market, or in this particular case, I brought a board game that's not commercially available but is complete, and we can play test it ourselves and discuss various aspects of gameplay and strategy, learn the rules, and play test it. So the game that I brought today was designed by a friend of mine, and this board game is called Fortress. And the other reason I brought up this game was because I was involved in play testing it, and I can speak to the iterative design process that Hal used when creating this game. Here's the contents of the Fortress game. We have a playing board. We have 6 sets of lead miniatures, 1 for each player. We have 4 monster figurines, a deck of treasure cards, treasure coins, dice, a rule book, and one aspect that I find interesting is the back of the game box has a story type scenario for the situation that players find themselves in this game, sort of speaking back to the Dungeons and Dragons feel. And then also has sort of a situational explanation of how the game is played, so that purchasers can learn a little bit about what the game's all about, other than just looking at the cover of the box. I'm going to start by showing you the finished version of the Fortress board, and then talk about a few of the iterations that it went through during the design phase. Hal started with a couple of key criteria, and that were namely that he wanted the game to have a Dungeons and Dragons feel. He wanted the setup to be relatively fast. He knew he wanted to have a square castle with parapets and towers to represent the fortress. He He wanted to have different classes of characters for each player to control. Players were going to roll dice for moving and combat. And he wanted to have lots of interaction between the players. And he wanted there to be more depth than breadth. And what he means by that is not as many features as there would be strategy. Okay, so the first iteration of the board would have been created on the back of a movie poster, because living up at the ski resort, we were kind of limited on the supplies that we had. Like I said, Hal knew that he wanted to have a square castle for the game to be played in. He knew that he wanted to have the parapet going around the outside and the two towers. Because players are supposed to roll dice to move and fight, early designs had the majority of the castle was rooms. Very few hallways, but a lot of rooms. And it's sort of complicated on, not a lot of movement. There was more movement than there was fighting, because somebody that was over here may have had to sort of like come out and travel inside to get into an actual room to access whoever was in there. And so that was one of the first design changes that he made. He actually changed it so that he had these nice hallways for players to move, so you could be on a room on one side or a room on the other side, and that created more opportunities for combat. Another thing he did was he opened up the center of the board so you could get more than two characters in here. In these tight hallways, you can see you might have a character standing there and a character standing there, and because of one of the rules of the game, they can't get by each other. So this open area invited more of the teams to get involved in combat here. One of the key aspects is the end game for Fortress, in which somebody has enough money to actually go out the front gate. And so that was another design consideration, that Hal wanted to make sure that there were many ways to actually get players from wherever they were to the front gate whenever somebody was threatening to win. So here you can see that we've got all these avenues that lead to the front gate, so that players could actually do something in time when somebody was threatening to win. Okay, so another iteration of the board design came when Hal realized that the structure of the game was such that the thieves were operating at a bit of a disadvantage in terms of combat against other players and combat against the monsters, and also in terms of the number of cards that they had. So what he decided to do was, in Dungeons and Dragons, thieves have the ability to set traps and detect traps. So Hal decided to make some of the rooms with a wooden floor. And he thought to himself, okay, and then that will allow the thief to basically set a trap, or players to set traps on wooden squares. He had to then think about, okay, what's going to happen to a player once he is trapped? He shouldn't die, but something should happen to him. So he decided to redesign, add dungeon cells, and redesign the corners of the board here. So you can see here what he did was he did a few things. He added a dungeon cell that would hold players and keep them from basically participating in the game. And then he added a lever square here that would allow, if a player's man was trapped in the dungeon cell, he could take one of his other men, move it onto the lever square, and then that would allow the player to move out of the the dungeon. The other thing was, he added some stairs as a bit of an aesthetic element to show that this is a dungeon area. Because players are now going to come to this area, he added sort of an open area for fighting with multiple pillars. He kept the couple of the treasures there, again, as incentive for people to go there. But you notice that one of the crossbone pillars here coincides. So now you're really sort of starting to develop gameplay where you have a mechanism for putting players in this area of the fortress. You have a reason for other players to actually come in there, which is the treasure and the levers, and then you also have the potential for monsters to show up there. Now, from a gameplay standpoint, one of the things that Hal had to consider was how many of the, what kinds of traps and how many. So he devised these regular traps that work on wooden squares, but not on thieves. And he determined that he would have 8 of those. And then he also devised 2 set traps that would work on any man on any square. And since those are pretty powerful, he had only 2 of those. He then added a mechanism for countering the traps, fine traps. He put in 4 of those, work on either the regular trap or the set trap. And then because he had added the dungeon element, he decided to also add a jailer's key card to the deck. So not only was the iterative process modifying the board, but it was also creating avenues for adding to the deck. Now, from the outset, Hal was creating structure in the combat system as well. The swordsman and the axeman would roll 3d6 when they fought. The thief would roll 2d6, and the wizard would roll a single die. So you can already see the structure taking place there, that fighters are obviously much more powerful than wizards. Thieves can sort of hold their own, for a time with the fighters. And I won't go into all the rules of combat for this video, but I did want to talk about the iterative process. Obviously, from a game balancing standpoint, you can see that the fighters have a really big advantage. And ultimately, when the monsters came along, he had to come up with a system for fighting monsters. Now, monsters don't roll dice. Instead, what he said was that if a monster were to come up against the fighters, they would have to roll 10 or better, which is just slightly below the mean roll on 3d6. The mean would be 10.5. So they have somewhere in the neighborhood of like a 67% chance of defeating a monster. The thief, however, also has to roll 10 or better when he fights against the monsters. And on 2d6, he's only got something like a 14% chance of winning. So he's very weak against the monsters. Now, the wizard can't possibly roll a 10 on a single 6-sided die when he fights. So he came up with a different system. If the wizard rolls a 6, he will actually dispel the monster and collect a card from whoever he's fighting. 2, 3, 4, and 5, the monsters back up. And wizard only dies on a 1. So in that case, the wizard was very powerful against the monsters. Now, as he started to develop the deck of cards, initially he just had money. So he decided that he would come up with denominations of 500, small denominations of 200, and one single card that's the a crown worth 1,000 gold pieces. And he had to balance, how many of these cards do I actually put in the deck? Because the winning condition depends on how many people play. He knew that he didn't want to have enough money cards in the deck for everyone to win. If there was fewer money less money, then players would have to get involved with trying to get money from other players so that they could actually win the game. Now, from a combat standpoint, just back to what I was talking about, when he started adding cards, he realized that he wanted to have different weapons. So he initially started with 2 fighters that were exactly the same, and then decided that he would differentiate between them by having an elf swords woman and a dwarven fighter who would wield an axe. So he added these cards for those characters, and then he modified the dice roll so that if they had one of these specialty cards, they would now roll 4d6 instead of 3d6. He gave the thief a poison dagger, and again, not to get into all the rules of the game, but combat isn't just one roll of the die and you're dead. In the open, you're allowed to back up 10 squares before you're actually killed. The poison dagger, if a thief wins in battle, instead of retreating, the opponent dies. So he actually boosted the threat factor of a thief with that particular card. Now, initially, he played around with the idea of a magic wand for the wizard, but he couldn't quite get that to work, so he scrapped that and said, well, wizards shouldn't really be great at fighting the other characters anyway. So to balance it out, he decided to give the wizard a series of specialty cards. And you can see that there's 5 specialty cards that the thief can use. They're partly informational. There's a ring of teleport that allows them to jump around from square to square, which gives them a lot of mobility with that card. All of these things had to be modifiers for existing game variables. So there's an amulet of reincarnation. When players get killed, he can bring them back to life. And all these specialty cards started creating opportunities for trading and borrowing and lending, buying or stealing cards. Ultimately, when it came time to looking at the balance, he decided that the thief was still sort of on the short end. You know, not all that great against the fighters. He only has the wizards that he can beat up on. Definitely weak against the monsters. So he decided to add 2 more specialty cards for the thieves. One allows him to steal cards from people who he's standing beside in the collection phase, the final phase of the game. And Boots of Speed is a modifier for the movement mode in the game. It allows him to add 6 to whatever he rolls with the dice. Another key design decision was the size and weight of the dice. Dice that were too big and too square tended to slide rather than roll. And if they were too heavy, they knocked all the treasure coins and the lead miniatures all over the place. Okay, that's it. I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I did making it. I'll just remind you of our key learning outcomes. To be able to identify the key components of the iterative game design process, which are to propose an idea for a game, build a prototype, play test it, evaluate the game for such aspects as playability, level of difficulty, amount of fun, any anti-fun elements, to redesign the game, make edits and additions, and then start the process over again by play testing. Another key outcome from this video was for you to be familiar with the what I consider to be one of the main principles of game design, which is that gameplay is key. Okay, the rest of the lesson plan for today is for you to complete the question sheet that I've provided to you. And then we'll break into groups. I've brought several copies of this game. We'll spend a little bit of time learning the rules, then we'll engage in some gameplay and have a discussion afterwards. Thank you for your time.